And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. We don't usually begin with hedge fund billionaires. Their forecasts tend to sound like strategy, not warning. Their vantage point is built from systems they helped engineer, portfolios designed to survive collapse rather than prevent it. Public skepticism is baked in. When a billionaire says the system is ending, the question is not just what does he see, but what has he already priced in? In political and philosophical writing, we are trained to look elsewhere for authority, to the historian, the theorist, the witness, those who read collapse as structure, not just volatility. But in early 2024, Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world, stood before the World Economic Forum in Davos and said something different. He wasn't talking about interest rates or recession cycles. He was talking about expiration. We're misreading the signs, he said. This isn't a cyclical correction. It's the end of a system. Behind the headlines on tariffs and inflation, he saw something deeper: debt saturation, institutional fatigue, geopolitical fragmentation, and the slow drift of legitimacy. For once, the language of capital overlapped with the architecture of collapse. Not a crash, a recursion, a system entering the final phase of its own logic. The end of a global order rarely arrives in fanfare. It dissolves through missed signals, abstract financial indicators, and political movements that seem provincial until they are irreversible. Today, Ray Dalio identifies this quiet disintegration as the final stretch of a long-term debt cycle. The problem, however, is not debt itself, but the architecture it supported, an unsustainable system of leverage, trust, and projection. Debt is not merely an economic instrument, it is a temporal wager, a belief that tomorrow can bear the weight of today's excess. When this belief fractures, so does the world it upheld. The current moment is not simply another turn of the business cycle, it is a culmination point. Western economies, especially the United States, have overborrowed in tandem with China's overextension through lending. The resulting imbalance is not bilateral, it is systemic. These are not just numbers on ledgers, but fractures in a shared epistemology of value. The old assumptions, growth without consequence, capital without constraint, order without violence, are failing. As capital retreats from its imagined neutrality, we witness the return of politics, not as ideology, but as structural rupture. This is not unprecedented. Giovanni Arrighi, in the long 20th century, theorized that capitalist expansion follows a pattern of accumulation, overreach and systemic reordering. Each hegemon, from Genoa to Britain to the United States, has built financial architectures that eventually outscale their productive bases. What follows is a financialization of decline, paper profits, speculative bubbles, imperial overreach, and then collapse. Arrighi names this as the terminal phase of systemic cycles of accumulation. The indicators are no longer subtle. Central banks function less as regulators and more as existential insurers. Markets rise on the expectation of intervention, not productivity. Nations cling to the illusion of solvency through asset inflation and manipulated rates. These are not corrections, they are ritual postponements. A system that rewards debt over labour and arbitrage over production does not malfunction, it metastasizes. And yet the response remains managerial. Policymakers tinker with interest rates and tariffs as though the problem were volumetric rather than foundational. But the logic of the system itself is unraveling. What is required is not stabilization, but reckoning, not a return to balance, but a recognition that balance itself was a myth underwritten by global asymmetry. The old order is not in recession, it is in expiration. Debt turned time into a cage, the silence of collapsed expectations, the ticking of a system past repair. There is a particular silence in democracies when they begin to fail, not the silence of consent, but of incoherence. Populism does not arise from ideology, but from exhaustion, a public no longer able to translate pain into policy. As inequality deepens and institutions hollow, the language of politics fractures into anger, nostalgia, and spectacle. What remains is not governance, but performance, calibrated to attention, not outcomes. The state, once a mediator of class and capital, becomes a stage for grievance. Dalio sees this as political fragmentation, but it is also a cognitive collapse, a civilization losing the grammar of consensus. Liberal democracy depends not only on laws, but on an emotional infrastructure, belief in procedure, deference to compromise, trust in abstraction. These are fragile inheritances. They do not survive contact with economic precarity or algorithmic rage. When people are locked out of housing, health and history, when futures are gated by code and capital, proceduralism feels like betrayal. In such terrain, autocracy is not imposed. It emerges as an answer to illegibility. What appears sudden is often the endpoint of a long erosion. The Weimar Republic did not collapse because democracy failed once. It collapsed because trust eroded gradually until the structures remained but were empty. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, argued that totalitarianism is not born from ideology but from loneliness. It is the dislocation of individuals from community and meaning that prepares the ground for authoritarian rule. The masses, stripped of stable identity and shared narrative, seek certainty even if it comes through cruelty. Autocracy arrives as clarity in the fog. Today's autocratic drift is algorithmically enhanced. Social platforms reward extremity while compress nuance and simulate participation. The public square is now a data mine, optimized for rage and fragmentation. These are not glitches, but features. Democracy, in its analog form, cannot survive a digital ecology designed to dissolve it. The demos becomes a feed, deliberation becomes latency, representation becomes noise. What emerges in this vacuum is governance as branding. Leaders become influencers, policies become gestures, and dissent becomes content. The danger is not simply that autocrats rise, it is that publics no longer resist. The desire for coherence outweighs the cost of control. The state shifts not with force but with fatigue. Apathy becomes assent. The vote persists but the voice falters. Legitimacy becomes ornamental. Consent fades into simulation. The contract is broken, but the rituals remain. History does not repeat, but it rhymes with increasing distortion. The multilateral order that emerged after 1945 was not natural. It was constructed through war, fear, and compromise. It offered a framework of rules designed to restrain chaos through alliance and institution. But frameworks are not self-sustaining. They require power to uphold them and belief to legitimize them. As the United States retreats from its role as guarantor, what unravels is not only alliance, but the logic of restraint. When power decouples from responsibility, order decays into rivalry. Ray Dalio describes this transition not as collapse but as shift, a phase in which unilateralism overtakes coordination and coercion replaces consensus. Trade wars, tech decoupling, and currency weaponization are not tactics but signs. They reveal the abandonment of multilateral trust and the return of power politics. Institutions designed to mediate conflict become irrelevant when conflict becomes a tool of policy. The WTO is sidelined, the UN neutralized, and diplomacy reframed as transaction. The international sphere no longer aspires to rules. It negotiates exceptions. Carl Schmitt, the German political theorist, argued that sovereignty is defined by the power to decide the exception. In his theory, the rule of law is secondary to the capacity to suspend it. This insight, forged in the crisis of the Weimar state, maps eerily onto our moment. The global system now functions through exception, extrajudicial drone strikes, sanctions without process, surveillance beyond borders. Sovereignty has migrated from states to platforms, from treaties to protocols. What remains is not law but decision, not diplomacy but targeting. The US-led order, once held by both military dominance and soft power, now strains under contradiction. Its rhetoric of democracy is undercut by internal disenchantment. Its economy of openness is undermined by protectionism. Allies recalibrate, rivals expand. China's Belt and Road is not a mirror of Bretton Woods. It is its negation. Infrastructure replaces ideology. Influence flows not through manifestos but mega-projects. The world reorders through logistics. Yet beneath this shift is a deeper instability, trust without anchor. Deterrence requires clarity. Today, ambiguity reigns. Red lines blur. Commitments dissolve. The logic of mutual assured destruction is replaced by irregular conflict and cyber ambiguity. War becomes persistent, low-grade, deniable. Peace becomes a pause between intrusions. The rules have not changed. They have evaporated. Protocols replace principles. Exceptionalism becomes default. The international becomes interpersonal, erratic and opaque. Markets behave like mirrors, distorting, not reflecting, the world beneath them. They are not neutral systems, but predictive fictions, extrapolating the future from the inertia of the present. When Ray Dalio points to market overreactions to tariffs or interest rates, he is not just analysing behaviour, he is diagnosing a system that has decoupled from reality. What moves the market now is not value, but narrative velocity. Price is no longer a signal of utility, but of belief, momentum, and fear. This dislocation is not merely speculative, it has become structural. The financial sector, once a facilitator of production, now dominates the real economy. Capital seeks return, not impact. Companies buy back shares instead of investing in labour. Real estate becomes a vehicle for storage, not shelter. Risk is no longer a constraint, it is a currency. In this regime, bubbles are not accidents, but necessities. They are the temporary fictions that keep the machine alive. Jean Baudrillard, in his theory of simulation, described a condition in which representation replaces reality. The sign becomes more real than the thing it signifies. This is the logic of financialization. Derivatives, indexes, and algorithmic trades create layers of abstraction so dense that the material base, labor, resource, infrastructure becomes invisible. What matters is not the underlying, but the sentiment. Not the yield, but the illusion of certainty. Markets simulate growth while societies stagnate. In such an environment, volatility becomes the measure of truth. A tweet can erase billions, a rumour can trigger recession. The feedback loops tighten. Media amplifies signals, algorithms chase patterns, investors move in herds. Rationality, once the cornerstone of economic theory, gives way to reflex. Behavioural finance becomes not a correction, but a concession. The admission that markets are not efficient, but emotional, recursive, and manic. This has consequences beyond the trading floor. Monetary policy now serves the market, not the populace. Central banks calibrate not for inflation or employment, but for investor confidence. Liquidity is injected not to stimulate production, but to stabilise indexes. The result is a bifurcation of economies. Asset-rich elites float, wage-bound majorities sink. Inequality is not a byproduct, it is the logic. Meanwhile, the very tools designed to stabilise the system, interest rate cuts, quantitative easing, fiscal backstops, lose potency. Diminishing returns set in. The patient requires ever larger doses for ever smaller responses. Trust in the system becomes performative. Belief is maintained not by evidence, but by necessity. Fiction cannot compound forever. The market persists as spectacle. Recovery becomes choreography. Collapse awaits no trigger, only a pause in the performance. Climate is not an externality. It is the stage, the actor, and increasingly the author of human affairs. It does not negotiate, respond to stimulus, or recognise sovereignty. It moves according to feedback loops and thresholds, not deliberation. When Ray Dalio includes climate disruption among the forces destabilising global order, he names not a variable, but a fundamental shift in agency. The environment no longer merely reacts to policy. It sets the terms of possibility. Economics and geopolitics now operate within a deteriorating planetary envelope. This deterioration is not linear. It is recursive and accelerative. Disasters trigger migration, which stresses borders, which fuels nationalism, which undermines cooperation, which delays mitigation. The result is a spiral in which each delay compounds the cost of action. Infrastructure decays under strain, insurance becomes untenable, markets misprice risk until they cannot. Climate becomes not just a crisis, but a systemic solvent, dissolving the assumptions of permanence, stability, and locality that undergird political economy. Timothy Morton's concept of the hyper-object captures this disorientation. Climate change as a hyper-object exceeds human scale in time and space. It cannot be seen whole, only encountered in fragments, fire seasons, flood maps, heat waves, droughts. Its vastness resists narrative, yet its effects are intimate. We breathe it. We budget for it. We die in its shadows. And yet, because it cannot be fully localized or timed, it remains for many abstract. This abstraction enables delay, and delay is fatal. Governments respond as if climate were an event, not a condition. Budgets are adjusted, not worldviews. Yet the atmosphere does not recognize fiscal quarters or electoral cycles. It accumulates. Every emission is a memory, every delay a debt. This is not a future problem, it is a temporal rupture. The present is already compromised, the past cannot be undone, and the future will not forgive. Technological optimism persists. Geoengineering, carbon capture, and green capitalism promise salvation through innovation. But these solutions, while not irrelevant, risk becoming ideological sedatives, delaying radical structural change in favour of market-friendly adjustments. The problem is not only carbon, it is the logic that prioritises growth, extraction, and consumption as default values. Climate collapse is not an accident of technology, it is a consequence of worldview. The map has changed, borders blur, then harden, crops fail, then vanish. Water wars emerge without declaration. The climate does not warm, it destabilises the coordinates of survival. What melts is not just ice but certainty. What burns is not just forest but future. Technology promises liberation but delivers enclosure. Each advance expands capacity while narrowing autonomy. Artificial intelligence, the most recent avatar of this paradox, does not simply automate tasks, it redefines them. It encodes preferences, optimizes attention, predicts behavior. What emerges is not efficiency, but preemption. Decisions are made before desire, outcomes shaped before action. When Ray Dalio warns that AI will further destabilize international relations, he names not just a new tool of power, but a new architecture of control. This architecture is opaque by design. Algorithms are not debated, they are deployed. Their operations are proprietary, their logics concealed within layers of abstraction. They mediate credit, employment, sentencing, surveillance, and war. They translate human uncertainty into computational risk, stripping context in favor of prediction. The result is a world managed by probabilities, not principles. Governance shifts from rule to recommendation, from judgment to modeling. Shoshana Zuboff's theory of surveillance capitalism outlines the deeper economic logic at work. In her analysis, personal experience is mined as raw material, behavioral surplus, extracted and commodified. The individual becomes not just consumer, but product. Agency is reduced to data signature, autonomy to algorithmic alignment. This is not just exploitation, it is epistemic capture. What is known, offered or even imaginable, is filtered through systems indifferent to meaning. As AI systems scale, they do not merely process reality, they generate it. Deepfakes erode evidentiary standards. Generative models flood discourse with plausible nonsense. Recommendation engines tilt cultural memory. Reality becomes stratified. One version for each feed, each identity, each surveillance regime. Truth becomes a performance of coherence within siloed systems. Consensus dissolves. Geopolitically, AI intensifies the logic of asymmetry. Nations race to dominate in data accumulation, model training, and deployment infrastructure. Military applications accelerate, autonomous weapons, predictive targeting, battlefield cognition systems. The line between civilian and combatant, user and target, erodes. War becomes computation at scale. Policy becomes simulation. Domestically, governance is redefined. Cities become smart, not just in sensors but in compliance. Risk scores shape policing. Social credit systems engineer behaviour. Citizens become inputs in feedback loops too vast to contest. Participation is replaced by integration. The ideal subject is not the voter, but the data point. Intelligence is no longer situated in minds or institutions, but in systems without face or address. And those systems have begun to govern. Legibility replaces justice. Prediction replaces trust. What governs now is not intention, but architecture. The algorithm does not rule. It organises the conditions in which rule appears natural. Debt is not only an economic condition, it is a metaphysical structure. It binds time, value, and obligation into a singular axis of control. To owe is to exist in deferral, to inhabit a future already spoken for. The global debt system, as Ray Dalio outlines, is nearing its limit, not in numerical terms, but in narrative exhaustion. The promise that debt will yield growth, that credit will resolve inequality, that financial expansion can outpace material constraint. These are fictions wearing thin. What remains is exposure. At the national level, debt becomes doctrine. Fiscal responsibility is invoked to justify austerity, while infinite military budgets expand unchallenged. Central banks monetize deficits in the name of stability, distorting signals and displacing risk. The illusion of solvency is maintained through performative metrics. GDP growth, bond ratings, inflation targets. But these measures do not account for ecological depletion, social fracture, or infrastructural decay. They quantify motion, not meaning. Maurizio Lazzarato, in his work on the indebted subject, argues that modern capitalism produces individuals as debtors before it recognizes them as citizens. Identity is constructed through obligation, student loans, mortgages, credit scores. The moral language of debt, responsibility, discipline, repayment obscures its structural violence. To be in debt is to be governed, not by law, but by ledger. Financial instruments become instruments of behavior. This logic extends beyond the personal. Entire nations are trapped in cycles of borrowing and conditionality. The IMF and World Bank prescribe reform in exchange for liquidity, embedding external control within domestic policy. Structural adjustment dismantles public systems under the guise of competitiveness. Sovereignty becomes collateral. Crisis becomes currency. But the system now cannibalizes itself. As debt saturates every layer of life, its capacity to command belief diminishes. Negative interest rates invert economic time. Default becomes policy. Bailouts normalize moral hazard. The boundary between public and private debt blurs until accountability dissolves. Markets trade not on fundamentals but on central bank inference. Money becomes metadata. This is not mere dysfunction, it is saturation. A system designed to defer collapse finds itself with no place left to defer. The tools for correction, devaluation, inflation, restructuring have been used, distorted and exhausted. What remains are extreme measures, capital controls, debt jubilees, currency realignments. These are not reforms, they are exits from a logic that no longer holds. Debt turned time into discipline, now it turns it into noise. Obligation becomes opacity. Redemption fades into ritual. The future collapses under the weight of what it was promised to pay. Monsters emerge when the categories fail. They appear in the thresholds between law and exception, human and machine, order and entropy. When Ray Dalio speaks of a system unraveling, what he implies but does not name is that the next world is not yet structured. It is monstrous, not because it is evil, but because it is illegible. The frameworks that once rendered the world navigable, liberalism, capitalism, sovereignty, now generate contradictions they cannot contain. The result is not void, but proliferation of actors, of logics, of claims on reality. In this space, governance becomes improvisation. States improvise authority through emergency. Corporations improvise legitimacy through service. Movements improvise identity through rupture. The traditional coordinates, left and right, global and local, public and private, are no longer oppositions but entangled loops. Power flows horizontally and vertically, chaotically redistributed through bandwidth and belief. What arises is not a new order, but a recombinant one, glitchy, recursive and unstable. Antonio Gramsci wrote, in the shadow of European fascism, that the old world is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, he said, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. The monsters are not just metaphors, they are mutations of form. Hybrid institutions, part platform, part state, govern without being elected. Ideologies cross-contaminate. Cults of personality replace doctrine. Truth is less contested than constructed anew. Each narrative ecosystem self-referential and immune to external arbitration. The monstrous is not always malevolent, sometimes it signals emergence. New forms of solidarity, care and resistance are also born in the rupture, but their structures are fragile, their vocabularies unstable. Without anchoring, they risk co-optation or collapse. The problem is not lack of energy, but lack of frame. The postmodern condition, fragmented, ironic, suspended, offered critique without construction. The moment now demands architecture. Yet architecture requires constraint, and constraint feels impossible in a world saturated with velocity. Every position is immediately echoed, weaponized, or absorbed. Attention itself becomes unstable. What was once slow political formation is now content life cycle. Revolt becomes aesthetic. Dissent becomes data. The monstrous multiplies. Still, in the flicker of these forms, something essential persists, a refusal to return. The nostalgia for order cannot reanimate legitimacy. The hunger for coherence cannot resurrect consensus. The task is not to purge the monsters, but to read them, to understand what new forms of life, power and meaning are struggling to surface through their distortion. There is a limit to how many contradictions a system can absorb before it begins to invert. When inequality, ecological collapse, political fragmentation, and technological opacity converge, they do not merely accumulate, they realign the coordinates of reality. The centre does not hold because the centre was always a function of consensus, and consensus has been structurally disabled. The result is not just instability, but a transition in the grammar of power. What once governed through institutions now governs through atmosphere, through volatility, fatigue, and ambient threat. Ray Dalio warns of radical measures on the horizon, defaults, capital controls, political extremes. But these are not deviations, they are emerging norms in a world shedding its former logic. Policy no longer aims to optimize, but to contain. States no longer plan, they brace. Control replaces growth as the underlying mandate of governance. The future is managed not toward vision, but towards survivability. Achille Mbembe, in his writings on necropolitics, explores the shift from governance of life to governance through death. Power in this model is expressed not by ensuring prosperity, but by managing exposure. Who is protected, who is disposable, who is made to wait, to suffer, to vanish. The calculus is no longer productive but subtractive. Crisis becomes a method, catastrophe becomes a system. Borders harden, not only geographically but economically, informationally, and biologically. Movement becomes privilege, certainty becomes luxury. Infrastructures of care are replaced by infrastructures of exclusion. Platforms mediate access, risk is redistributed downward, resilience is privatized. In this configuration, inequality is not a failure, it is the logic of allocation. Meanwhile, imagination is compressed. Culture echoes, recycles, and defers. Utopias shrink. Dystopias normalize. The horizon of transformation collapses into a politics of reaction. Restore, protect, defend. In such a landscape, language itself erodes. Words like freedom, justice, and solidarity are deployed without referent, gestures without anchor. Political speech becomes performance, policy becomes theatre. Yet the transition is not total. Fault lines remain, silenced contradictions resurface, suppressed memories reassert, displaced voices begin to form new grammars. The rupture does not guarantee renewal, but it opens the interval in which renewal is possible. That interval is dangerous, unstable, and brief. The old orders did not fall because they failed to adapt. They fell because they mistook inertia for stability. What defined their end was not violence, but drift, until drift became freefall. The markers of collapse are not always dramatic. Often they arrive as normalization of suffering, of surveillance, of silence. Not a moment of rupture, but a slow forgetting that anything else was possible. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.